Welcome to the Mayo Clinic Human Optimization Project, where we're creating the blueprint to help you become the best human you can be so you can give your gifts back to the world. I'm your guide and fellow optimizer, Christopher Camp. We all want to age well, and this is true for our physical bodies, our mental sharpness, and our social relationships. The social aspects of our lives is one that's often neglected, but this is a huge mistake. One of the greatest drivers of joy in our lives is having genuine and meaningful relationships with people we care about. So, why is this often a challenge for us? And why does it get harder for us as we age? This is a question that we shouldn't wait to answer until we're past our prime. Setting ourselves up to age well socially begins early in life. Accordingly, the topic of our session today is aging well socially, how to remain connected to people and purpose throughout your life. Our expert here to walk us through this is Dr. Melanie Chandler. Dr. Chandler is an associate professor and chair of the Division of Psychology at Mayo Clinic, Florida. Dr. Chandler's current professional responsibilities as a board certified neuropsychologist include a mixture of administration, research, patient care, and teaching. She's been consistently funded for 20 years to conduct research into behavioral interventions in aging and mild cognitive impairment. She co founded the Healthy Actions to Benefit Independence and Thinking, or HABIT, program that provides behavioral interventions and rehab techniques in patients with MCI offered now at multiple major medical centers. She also leads the Ralph C. Wilson Jr. Foundation Endowment for the HABIT program at Mayo Clinic. Well, Melanie, thank you so much for joining us on the Human Optimization Project.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me today.
Good. I think this is a great topic. And to try to keep us organized, we're going to structure this in three different sections. Each one has a little different purpose. So each section has a theme question for it. So our first big section, the question is going to be, what does aging well socially look like and why is it important? The second section, our big question is, why do so many of us struggle with our relationships and sense of purpose as we move through life? And then finally, in that third section, we're going to try to get into some solutions for this. So the big question there is, what practical steps can we take now to ensure we remain connected as we age? So, you up for that?
Sounds great.
All right, so let's dive into this first section. And I think it's helpful just to kind of start by defining some terms. So I want to know from your perspective as an expert in the field, what does it mean to age well socially?
Right. It's a great place to start. And that's because I think a lot of people have in mind this idea that you need to be the person who has the most friends or the person who has the most social engagements on your calendar. And that's really not what I'm thinking of when I'm thinking about aging well socially. I'm thinking about having at least some meaningful relationships. Those relationships where you feel supported by other people, valued by other people, that just gives you a sense of being connected to others. And that could be a large group of friends. It could just be a couple people that really get you and know you. And I think it also has to do with being engaged in your community. Whatever those ties are in your community that help give you not just a feeling of connection, but add to your sense of identity and kind of your purpose and meaning in life.
So that's great. And I'm hearing you say that it's not just about quantity. So it's not the number of relationships, but it's largely determined by the quality of those relationships. So all of the introverts out there are breathing a big sigh of relief, saying, "Okay, good. I don't have to go get a massive friend list here or go talk to a bunch of people I don't want to talk to." So I like that you emphasize that it's the quality over the quantity, but it's also what you're saying. This is not just about other people. This is about, yes, developing quality relationships with other people, but also being engaged in your community as well. So I think there's a couple different lenses and ways that we can look at this based on what you're describing there. One of the things I've heard you talk about is how social connections, meaningful social connections, are really related to our sense of purpose. So, how does purpose relate to social connections?
Yeah, I think it's really important to not just think about the social relationships, but also your sense of purpose, because these things really go often hand in hand, and both are really important for healthy aging. Very often, when you ask people about their sense of purpose, or kind of that reason for getting out of bed in the morning, it has to do with other people, right? It has to do with either those really close friends or that community. And your community could be your family. It could be your neighbors. It could be the community more generally. But often that sense of purpose, or what gives you a sense that your life has meaning, for many people does revolve around their social relationships, right? You feel like other people need you, that you contribute this to other people around you. A sense of purpose doesn't always have to be social. You could get sense of purpose by some kind of artistic pursuit that you do, or spirituality or personal goals that you have for yourself. But a lot of the times these things just go right together, and as both can be beneficial for aging, people can benefit from engaging in both of these things.
So there's a lot of positive synergy, I think, that happens between our purpose and genuine connections. And it's interesting that you talk about those two things because if we look at the world's literature on joy and what really brings us joy, we talk about that a lot here on the Human Optimization Project, but there's really three things. And it's making progress towards goals that are important to us, it's having a sense of purpose and fulfilling that purpose, and then also meaningful social connections. And you just labeled two-thirds of the things that give us joy. So if we can tie our sense of purpose in with our social connections, then they'll have a synergistic effect on improving our joy. And you also mentioned early on when you were defining aging well socially that these social interactions need to be meaningful and they need to be genuine. That's going to be much easier to do if it's rooted in our purpose, rather than just having these arbitrary relationships that aren't really founded on anything. Can you tell me now? One of the things that we think a lot about is when we talk about aging is also sort of our cognitive function. So, what is the connection between our social connections and our sense of purpose, and how does that impact how we age cognitively, or what our cognitive function is?
Yeah, there's been a good amount of research done in both of these. Both you're having a social connection with others and having a sense of purpose, and how it helps folks as they age maintain their thinking skills. So like their memory, their cognitive functions, and actually reduce risk of dementia as well. There's been longitudinal studies done where they ask all kinds of questions to healthy older adults and follow them for years and years, and look to see what factors determine or help predict who's going to get dementia. And among some of the kind of more behavioral, kind of psychological variables, having a sense of purpose rises to the top. Those people who say, yeah, you know what, I feel like my life has meaning and there's something I'm contributing, have a lower risk of dementia. The same thing for folks who are not living in isolation, don't feel lonely. When somebody has kind of gone to the other end of the spectrum from being socially engaged to, endorsing feeling lonely, then that person really has an elevated risk of going on to have dementia later on.
Mm, very, very compelling. When we think about this need for fulfilling our purpose and this need for the social connections, that's not just unique to us as we age. Really, we need to do that in all phases of our lives. But I think that there are some unique challenges to making meaningful social interconnections as we get older, as we're adults and older adults. So, what are some of the factors that influence how we form social connections and bonds as we get into the later stages of life?
Yeah, I think that when we're younger, like kids, right? It comes pretty natural. We're set up in situations to make that happen, right? You are in a classroom with others your age, or you're in after school activities with other people that have similar interests to you. So it's just so much more readily just laid before you to make friends and make social connections. And then as we, enter into adulthood, we're navigating those time periods of making the most meaningful connections to us. We're starting our jobs, going to school, and again, you're surrounded by other people who also are doing what you're doing or might share your same interests. So as people get later on in life, some of these things start to change for them. Think about the person in midlife who has had their kids at home or maybe also caring for older parents, and now they're empty nesters, right? Or they're having to rethink that kind of connection that they had before. Maybe they've retired and now you don't have that whole group of friends that were your colleagues, right? That you worked with. And so you really, as you age, it's not just laid before you and made easy. You have to make more of an effort to maintain and to particularly to make new friendships.
I've heard it said that friendship is a team sport when you're a child, and then it becomes an individual sport as you become an adult because your situation is very different, unique, and you're not forced into situations where everybody around you is at a similar life stage or has similar life circumstances. And so you're much more of a unique individual at that stage, which is wonderful. And that can be a huge blessing in a lot of ways, but it definitely makes these social connections a little more challenging. So when we get into our third question, we'll talk about how to our third section. We'll talk about how to overcome that, and I'm looking forward to that. Can you tell me what are some of the benefits that we see for people who optimize social connections as they age? We already talked about some improved cognition or decreased cognitive decline, but what are some other benefits to it?
Well, I mean, I think we also have to talk about some of the obvious ones. Maybe it seems obvious, like your mood is improved as you get older. If you have social connections, your risk of having depression goes down when you feel like you're socially connected. In general, you just have a stronger resilience to life stressors and how you cope and handle those things that go your way when you're more socially connected. But there's also a large body of research that demonstrates that yes, we talked about the dementia risk, but other health outcomes. So think things like cancer survival, how well somebody does after receiving a transplant, or other kind of cardiac types of outcomes. There's a lot of body of research that suggests that those who are most socially engaged have support systems just fare better in terms of their health.
It's a tremendous list. I mean, and those are things that we all really need at every stage of our life, and particularly as we start to get older too. So I think it's going to be important for us to form some of those foundational habits early on. What are some common misconceptions that you see that people have around aging well socially and retaining their sense of purpose?
Well, I think one is this fallacy that it's just it's too late to make friends or it's too hard to make friends, and it might be hard but it's not too late,
Mm.
right? To go out and do it. You're not there's this kind of image of somebody who is older and they're just kind of at home and dependent on family for any kind of socialization they have. And when that happens, because it does happen, it's very difficult for them, but it doesn't have to be like that. A person who's older can have lots of socially engaging activities, can have close friends that they have with them. I think I hear a lot. I work with a lot of older people day in and day out, and sometimes bemoaning technology and how technology now gets in the way of how we communicate and how we socialize, and nobody picks up a phone anymore or something. We pick up our phones all the time, but maybe not in the way that
Not to
they
talk on.
think about, right, to text on them. But technology has also changed how we can stay connected with each other, right? I think that those who I used to hear it more before the pandemic, and then folks realize, wow, there's these things like Zoom calls or FaceTiming or other video conferencing where I can stay in touch with my adult kids across the country, or I can be there at my grandkids' basketball, tournament, be there, virtually. Technology can also help people stay connected if you have an open mind to it. And so I think those two, and then also with a purpose. I think the sense of purpose, people have this idea that it has to be something really big. So when I, give a presentation on having a good sense of purpose, and I ask people in the group what they do that gives them a sense of purpose, often it's somebody who does something really awesome that responds first, right? It's somebody who says something like, "Oh, I volunteer at my local community to feed the homeless and bring world peace," or whatever it is that they say they do, something great. Others in the group might think, gosh, that's what it means to have a sense of purpose. That's great. If that person is doing those things, fantastic. But sense of purpose does not have to be changing the world. Sense of purpose can be just making a change within your family or adding something of value there. So just, checking in on your neighbor to make sure they're okay, making your son's favorite rolls when he comes back for Thanksgiving. All of these things can be a sense of purpose. It doesn't have to be so big.
That's a great one. I do think purpose intimidation is a real thing. People look at this and it's like saying, I look at LeBron James playing basketball and I say, well, I'll never be able to do that. So I might as well not play recreational basketball. People would say, well, that's silly. Obviously that's not real. It's like, well, purpose is actually the same thing. So yeah, start small and do what works for you. Let's shift here into this second section where we're going to talk about why so many of us struggle with our relationships and sense of purpose as we move through life. So first, I'm coming at this assuming that many of us do struggle with it. Is that true? How bad of a problem is this for us overall as a society?
Right. And so I pulled down some numbers in anticipation of this question with you. And, one thing that came out was in the US, 1 in 4 adults say that they're socially isolated. Now, socially isolated is a little bit different context or definition where it has more to do with how often are you interacting with people? Do you live with anybody else? Really a more concrete, like you're not around other people versus asking somebody if they feel lonely, right? Which is a little different concept. So 1 in 4 are socially defined as having social isolation in this country, and 1 in 3 say they feel lonely. So the loneliness is endorsed so often that not too long ago, the Surgeon General actually called loneliness an epidemic and said it was on par with smoking or obesity in this country, that we needed to do something with how often people feel lonely.
Which I don't think is a stretch given all of the benefits
Yeah.
you mentioned earlier from being socially connected. So if you're not connected, if you feel isolated or you feel lonely, obviously you're not going to get those benefits, which is going to have adverse outcomes in multiple areas of your life, which I think is really
Right.
reasonable. One of the questions I have is about timing. So when does this start to be an issue? Because I think we often think about, well, I don't want to be socially isolated when I'm old. Was it so I'm going to do this when I get to an older age, whatever that age is for you, however you define that. But this is probably something we should be thinking about earlier rather than waiting till we get there. Prevention is usually the best cure. When do we need to start thinking about this, and when does it start to be an issue?
I think as soon as early adulthood, there is good evidence that if you just stick to adulthood, that loneliness is kind of what they call a U-shaped curve, in that young adults and older adults tend to have the most loneliness, and those in kind of midlife tend to be less lonely overall. And that's, when you are a young adult, you're still learning your place in life. You know, you've just maybe left your parents and that support. Maybe you have, and maybe you haven't found that significant other in your life. And so, navigating through all that process of becoming who you are can increase your risk of loneliness, right? And then in midlife, you have your career often that you're engaged in, or your kids and your kids' parents are your friends. You have some access to people around you to make friends and not feel as lonely. Plus, maybe you have your own kids at home. Maybe your parents are still alive in midlife, so you have that family to not feel as lonely as well. And then the loneliness creeps back up in older age. So really, we need to start thinking about it, even with those young adults, and addressing the loneliness that's going on there.
Mhm. And I think of that sort of akin to some of the physical decline and physical changes that happen to us as we age. We know that some level of physical decline is inevitable as we get older. We try to do a lot of things to combat that or prevent that or at least slow that. Is the same thing true about social decline? Is social decline inevitable as we age?
I don't think that it's inevitable. It is something that you, if you don't take action against it, and you're not somebody who already has these long-term relationships and friends, because I don't know, you've never left the same town you grew up with and you have all these people available. I think folks are at risk as they get older of becoming less social, but it's not something that's inevitable.
And it's something that we may have more agency in or more control over, even than the physical decline. And we know there's a lot going on right now. We're trying to prevent that physical decline, but this is somewhere where we may be able to have an even bigger impact and a little bit bigger control.
Mhm.
So, what are some of the common behaviors or attitudes that people may have that make the social decline accelerate more rapidly for them?
I'd like to pick up on the common attitudes and behaviors, but also going back to something you're talking about, just about physiology, makes me also think that there's some things that happen in aging that can also get in the way of socializing that we should point out.
Hmm.
And one of those is hearing loss that
Hmm.
happens as folks get older. And I mean, as many as two-thirds of folks over 70 can have a significant hearing loss. And hearing loss can be socially isolating. Folks will withdraw from events, from dinner parties, things like that, because they can't hear, or even within their own family time at home, they are out of conversations because they're not hearing them. And so we really have to be mindful of how hearing loss, well, can impact social engagement and loneliness. Mobility changes that happen, down here in Florida, I hear about golf a lot, and a lot of my older folks who were that was kind of their social circles. A lot of people retire down here to Florida to play golf. And if you have changes in your back or your hips or something that's not allowing you to do that anymore, folks have to rethink their kind of social lives. And that's just one example of how mobility changes can affect you. I mean, it could be so bad that you're not physically able to get out and about as much as you used to and engage with people as well. And I have to also bring up just some natural normal aging cognitive decline that happens that sometimes will impact people. So, pretty normal aging phenomenon to have that thing where you can't think of a word or somebody's name. Yeah, gosh, that person's name, I should know it. Um, or just having a little bit of memory difficulty that goes along with normal aging. For some people, that risk of embarrassing themselves in those situations, they want to pull back in terms of socializing as well. So I think we got to. There are some unique things physiologically that older adults have to consider and overcome too when it comes to socialization. So it's not just about your access to other people, it's also these other things getting in the way.
Yeah, I can absolutely imagine how all of those things, hearing loss, mobility changes, some even slight cognitive decline, will cause people to retreat and be less engaged, and then put them at risk for that loneliness and isolation. But that's a great call out. And then now, what about the second part of that question, the behaviors and attitudes?
I think one is just to start back with that withdrawing out of embarrassment piece of it. And that could be from cognitive, that could be hearing, that could be mobility changes. All of those I've seen seniors withdraw because of fear of being embarrassed. But I really want to encourage people to kind of find a group of people who you feel accepted by, who you can still engage with. And often it's that's more of the case than not, that people are accepting. They also are having their own issues, right, in your age group when you're older. So to kind of get over that idea that it's too embarrassing. The other one is that it's too much work to make new friends. Oh, I'm retired for a reason. Well, you earned your retirement, but you also really want to have that socialization and again, sense of purpose. So it's worth the work for the reasons we've already been talking about, right? And I think another one is going back, I think you brought it up at the beginning of the conversation, the introverts versus extroverts, right? And just to drive home that point that we are not asking introverts to suddenly become extroverts. So being an introvert isn't an excuse for not having some social relationships that are meaningful and powerful for you, right?
Those are great. And I would imagine a lot of this involves that individual coming to terms with that themselves, whether that's
Mhm.
hearing loss, mobility issues, cognitive decline, feeling like it's too much work, introversion, anxiety around social connection. So, one is that person needs to understand those feelings that they're having that's holding them back. But I would imagine another component of that is probably communicating those concerns and issues to others. And if you just think about the hearing issue, if somebody tends to retreat because they can't hear, that's going to be problematic. But if you're able to tell other people about that, they can either help you, get you some help to overcome that issue, or now they know, okay, we just need to speak louder, or talk to the other side, or do a good job of explaining things, and that way it's both people or both groups of parties working on keeping that person included and preventing their isolation. So even though there may be some resistance or embarrassment with coming to terms with some of those issues, it can actually be quite powerful, not only for the individual, but also the people around them that want them to be engaged.
Yes, when I'm talking with groups of older individuals, often this idea of who do I tell and whose business that I tell, be that about memory loss, be that about hearing loss, physical changes. But most of the time, when people do tell other people, engage other people, they find that they actually get way more support and feel way more included than the fear they had about being excluded or judged because of this change. And it also makes me think of the person themselves, maybe showing some flexibility to embrace some adaptations, like, wearing the hearing aids, right? Just hear so many battles over wearing the hearing aids and what that means. And just being willing to engage and use some of these things.
Mhm. And we actually have a session coming up in the future on having a growth mindset, and a lot of these sort of concepts kind of come up in that, in dealing with some of those things that maybe make you uncomfortable, but it's often better to lean into it rather than run away from it.
Right.
Okay, so now let's get into the third section. You're going to give us all the answers of how we can fix this problem, and some steps we can take to make it better. So, my first question is, as we start in this section, is I want to know, is this something that we can actually impact? So, how much of our social function is actually modifiable, or are these mostly fixed traits that we can't overcome?
I think that there's a lot that could be changed. And I think that it's important to again pick up on the idea of the introverts versus the extroverts, right? Now that is more of a fixed trait, so to speak. That's like a personality style. But that's again not what we're talking about. We're talking about just how social you're being and having some meaningful connections. So that is something that is changeable, right? But instead of changing your personality style and the cognitive function piece, yes, some of that is genetic, it's fixed, but you also have the ability to modify that from an early age and throughout your lifespan to some degree. So these are definitely still things that you can have impact on.
Part of it is defining what those things are and not trying to change the things you can't, but figuring out how you can approach it differently. Like I know, for instance, I tend to be a little bit more introverted. My wife Erica is extremely extroverted, and I imagine as we age, for me, it's going to be like, okay, who are those 3 to 5 really close friends that I have great deep relationships
Mhm.
with, and that's what I need. For her, it'll probably be more like a few hundred close friends that she has deep relationships with,
Right.
and that's okay. Like the two, I shouldn't try to be like her because that's going to be really challenging, difficult, and honestly, maybe quite miserable for me. And the same thing for her. She shouldn't try to be like me. So we kind of have to know who we are and what we are, and then make the decision on how I'm going to act intentionally as a result of that.
Right, right.
So if we recognize, okay, this is kind of who I am, this is what I envision my life looking like as I get older, when do we need to start on that process? I think the tendency is always say, well, I'll wait till I retire and then I'll figure out what I'm going to do at that stage of my life. But that's probably not the right answer. When do we need to think about it?
And I think if we're going to talk about both cognitive function and social function, I think the earlier the better. There's this idea of building up a cognitive reserve, and you could think the same thing for a social kind of reserve. So think about it as, uh, again, I'm talking to you from Florida, but a reserve is like putting sandbags around your house when a flood is coming, right? And the more you build up and you stack up those sandbags, the less likely you're going to experience the flood. But in this case, we're talking about cognitive decline or social isolation is the flood. So we want to build up this reserve, get our fortifications in place, so to speak. And from a very early age. So when it comes to cognitive function in particular, you're building up your cognitive reserve through stimulating activities, your education, having the fortune of being in a healthy environment that's not kind of detracting from any of that. And then as you move into your young adulthood, you're also still building up your cognitive reserve through education, often getting established in a career that's challenging you mentally. So it becomes more about just like not screwing things up through things like, drinking too much or
Right.
smoking or something that's going to kind of give your brain a blow, so to speak. You want to keep things going well. And then midlife is really critical when it comes to like cognitive aging. More and more research is showing like what you do in your 40s and 50s is setting the stage of what you're going to experience 60s and beyond in terms of your brain health. And so that's when, we're talking, we're going to watch our blood pressure, we're going to get physical exercise, we're going to diet, we're going to make sure we're being social if that is starting to become a problem. This is when we want to start really making sure, because now once we're in our older age, we've kind of already set the decks for ourselves, right? Of our cognitive reserve, any how we've been socially, making sure we're being socially engaged to keep that social reserve. We just have to work harder. It's not that once we get to that stage, we can't overcome things, right? But the more we set ourselves up early on, the better, the less hard we have to work at it in older age.
I've never heard this term or concept of social reserve, but I love it. And it makes sense to me. I think that anybody who's thinking about approaching older age, if you think about it from a financial perspective, we're all told save, start early, invest regularly. And if you ask retirees what's the biggest financial mistake they made, or the one thing they would change, they would all say, financially, I should have started saving earlier. I didn't realize it. And so I think we all kind of conceptually understand, okay, I need to build up this large financial nest egg of funds to support me later when I retire. So I think everybody gets that. From a physical standpoint, I think people sort of get it as well. If I want to be able to hike a mile when I'm 80, I should probably be able to hike 3 to 5 miles when I'm 50, and even more than that when I'm 30. And so we understand that concept reasonably well, but I haven't thought about it from the social perspective, or the cognitive perspective. So I like this concept of having a cognitive reserve and a social reserve. And a lot of that, you're right, it does start in our early adulthood, 20s and 30s, and big changes happen in our 40s and 50s. So no matter the age of our listeners out there, there's something you can be doing now to help you set yourself up in the future. Okay.
That's right.
So let's go through, and you kind of gave us some bullet points for each of those age groups. I'd kind of like to make those a little bit more concrete for our audience.
Okay.
So why don't we start? Let's say the youngerish ages. So maybe we'll go folks in their like 30s to 50s, somewhere in there. What are a list of practical strategies that somebody in that age bracket can start doing in their 30s and 50s to help them stay sharp, cognitively and socially?
Hmm. Well, I think socially, it's about prioritizing relationships, right? And treating it almost like it's a doctor's appointment or something that you schedule or you are very intentional about, not just letting it be something on the sidelines. Because again, in your 20s, for many people, that's all that it's about. They're trying to find that mate. They're starting a family. They're doing that. And then maybe some of us go on coast maybe a little too hard once you get in your 30s and 40s, and you gotta, resist the coast and really be intentional and call up that friend you used to hang out with all the time, or join that club that's interesting to you, and really don't make it an afterthought, but schedule it, make it a priority. And, if you find yourself in a situation where you just don't have that access to as many people, right? How we talked about how work can just there's colleagues in front of you to befriend, or when you're a student, there's other students. Well, if you find yourself where you don't have that access, make that access. Go find a club or a group, volunteer somewhere, whatever puts you in a position to be around other people who are likely to have similar interests to you, that you can look to make friends with, right? I think that those are a couple of really big ones. And use technology, and use it wisely. I think if we're, depending on what age of the 30s to 50s you're talking about, I think some of us were brought up talking on that phone more than texting,
Mhm.
or meeting somebody somewhere to see them in person. Again, technology can help boost and foster our ability to connect with people, but there is something irreplaceable about hearing a voice that or being with a person. So, taking some time to be intentional. And if you're talking about what to do cognitively, not just socially, being physically active, getting that physical exercise in is so important in midlife for your cognition, and just taking care of your health in general, eating well, see the doctor, make sure your blood pressure is okay, make sure your sugars are all right. That sort of thing is just going to set you up so much better cognitively if you just are mindful of it at those ages.
This is a great list. So just to recap, so the things to do from a social perspective in your 30s and 50s. So prioritize relationships, be intentional, schedule time for your relationships, don't coast, actively cultivate meaningful interpersonal interactions, make access by joining groups, clubs, or other organizations, and use technology wisely. I think that's a great call out too on the technology piece. You said use it wisely rather than allowing it to use you, which many of
Right.
us do. And
Sure.
also, it's very easy to say, in your 30s to 50s is when people start to say, I don't understand how to use this gadget or widget or whatever, so I'm just going to stop. Well, if you don't figure out how to do it then, it's going to be a lot harder to do that in your 70s or 80s. And then from a
Right.
cognitive perspective, take care of your health, really get some exercise, and make sure you're regularly visiting your doctor. Okay, that's a great list. Now let's move to the other end of the spectrum. We've got a wide range of ages in our listenership here. So for our folks out there that are maybe getting closer to older age and later years, what would you say to them? So let's say now we're talking about people that are in their, let's say, 70s and 80s. What advice would you give them to continue to maintain and nurture good social relationships and to stay sharp cognitively?
Yeah, I think one is really think about quality over quantity again. And, when they ask a lot of older individuals kind of their preferences in general about friends, that they tend to, people as we get older tend to gravitate towards less relationships that are more meaningful to us. And so, very practically, think about what are your strongest ties that already exist, or are there relationships out there that you already have but you'd like it to be even closer. So you might not think about how much you want to go out and meet new people, although if you need to, please do. But as you get older, also think about how do you foster and really deepen the relationships that you do have as well. And I think very practically, to go back to the concept of, uh, please try what you can to adapt to changes in your health, your ability, your mobility. Again, get those hearing aids, get whatever mobility supports that you need to get out and about. Try to be adapted to that. Too often I see folks that, something's happened, they've got a bad back, and again, their relationships were playing. I talked about golf already, so let's throw out another Florida pickleball. Is their kind of thing, and so now because I can't do my pickleball, I can't. It's like this. Like I just the whole world's been taken away from me, and now they're home on the couch. Well, that is a loss, and it's a loss that you're going through that. It's a loss of, what that activity with that friend group, but what else can you do? How else can you get out there? So be willing to be flexible and think of other things to overcome those kinds of challenges. And I think reframing that sense of purpose and start small. If you don't, I like to use that term, what's your reason for getting out of bed in the morning? Because I think that resonates with people. And if you have a hard time answering that, then try to find something small. Again, it could be getting a pet. I hear that one. I hear that when folks are really struggling with sense of purpose and maybe depression, that they go and get a dog because then the dog needs them, and the dog needs to be walked, and the dog needs to be fed. And just having that start of something that gives you purpose. Not that I'm telling all of your listeners to go out and adopt a dog, but it's just as an example, or volunteer to watch your grandkids so your daughter can, go out every other Friday night or whatever it is, things like that to give some sense of purpose there. So small bites, I guess, to engage towards the growing sense of purpose.
That's a great list as well. So what I wrote down for there for folks in their, 70s and 80s. So focus on quality over quantity, which I think is
Mhm.
the quantity piece. I think can be very intimidating for people. So if
Right.
you just focus on deepening relationships, making them more higher quality, and think about strengthening relationships that you already have in place. You don't have to always start from scratch. And then also ask what's holding you back. Earlier, you talked about some physiologic changes, hearing loss, mobility changes, cognitive decline, or some attitudes, worried about embarrassment, it's going to be too much work, or I'm too introverted. Ask if any of those things are holding you back, and address that as well. Reframe your sense of purpose. Think about your reason for getting out of bed, and then get creative. Start small. Get a pet. Volunteer. Those are all excellent examples. So, Melanie, this has been excellent. I think that you've given us a very strong and compelling reason that we all need to be thinking about how we function socially as we age. You also did a great job of making a very clear argument that this is something that starts much earlier in life. So ideally, you want to start it as soon as you can, but it's never too late. The best time to plant a tree was 50 years ago. The second best time is today. So wherever you are in your walk of life, you might as well go ahead and get started with this. So I'd like to take a minute here. I'll just summarize my notes that I've been taking, and then I'll give you a chance to run through our three big questions again. So
Before you
aging,
summarize,
yes,
can I give you a fact I've been holding back, waiting for the
please, yes,
opportunity?
please.
Hoping it's if we hadn't convinced the listeners yet, that maybe we can convince them. There was a study done. So there's this U.S. health and retirement study that tracks tens of thousands of people. So this was 11,000 people. It's a lot of people in the U.S., right? And they found that folks that reported feeling lonely had a 57% increased risk of dying over the period of the study. So this is all older people. It's a retirement and aging study, right? And so when they followed this group of people over the years, your risk of dying for any reason was 57% higher than those who weren't lonely. And so I wanted to like give it that last push. Of all these great things we've talked about, I'll just even throw on the table death
Wow.
into it. So
And to be honest with you, if you look at all the interventions and medications and exercise programs and diets and everything else we have out there, not many of them have that big of an impact on death. 57%, that's a massive impact. That is something we all need to be paying attention to.
right.
Okay. Thank you
Sorry,
for
go ahead, summarize.
all right, so my summary is, aging well socially. It's not just about the numbers; it's the quality of your relationships, not just the quantity. And there's a component of it that involves us being engaged with other people through genuine social interactions, but also with our community. And it's most effective when it's rooted in our purpose. And both purpose and social connections improve our cognition, decrease dementia risk, and improve joy. And they also, there's a lot of other benefits too. So improved mood, decreased depression, improved resiliency, less stress, increased health in terms of cancer, transplant patients, heart disease, and now you just told us death.
Right.
Basically everything.
Yeah.
We talked about how this gets harder as you get older. When you're younger, friendship is sort of a team sport. You're all forced into situations where everybody's in the same life stage and situation. But later on, friendship becomes an individual sport as an adult, where everybody's at a different stage and different circumstances. So it becomes more challenging. But we can overcome that. We have to be more intentional. About 1 in 4 U.S. adults feel socially isolated, and about 1 in 3 feel lonely. And now we know that those folks that are lonely have a 57% higher chance of dying. The good news is that social decline as we age is not inevitable. So that makes it different than physical decline. There's a lot of physiologic changes and behavioral or attitude things that happen to us that increase our risk for social decline. So we need to be aware of those and try to address those. You also introduced the concept of social reserve, which I had not thought about in the past, but I love it. And I want our audience to think about that. You gave us a great list of things to be doing if we're in our 30s and 30s to 50s, and then also another set of things to be doing if we're in our 70s and 80s. So go back and listen to that third section where Melanie outlines all of those topics for us as well. So a lot of great information packed in there. Melanie, now I'm going to give you a chance to summarize by answering our three big questions. You've done it very well over the last 45 minutes or so, but I'll give you a chance for some rapid fire answers here. So number one, What does aging well socially look like, and why is it important?
Well, again, aging well socially means that you have quality supportive relationships, right? That where give you a sense of purpose in your life, so that's going to help you protect your mood, your cognitive function, and like we were saying, even your longevity potentially.
Great. Our second one, why do so many of us struggle with our relationships and sense of purpose as we move through life?
Well, we all face different life transition stages, right, throughout our lifespan. So, life transition, health changes, and naturally just kind of shrinking social networks are things that we really have to work against because they make it harder to stay connected. So, want people to really combat those things that we talked about, like the hearing loss, mobility issues, any self-limiting beliefs about what it means to be social or make friends, so that you can kind of fight that and not drift off into being disconnected from other people.
Okay. And the third big question, what practical steps can we take now to ensure we remain connected as we age?
Right, so invest in your relationships and do it early so that you can have, again, those quality relationships. This is an essential, it's not just a luxury extra that you would be nice to have in life, right? Go out and make access if you don't have it. So join groups, volunteer for things so that you can be around others that are like-minded, and just keep learning, stay active in general for your just general kind of psychological and cognitive well-being. So it's never too late, like you said. Even whatever you did in the past, today's a new day. Never too late to start working on these things.
All right, great. So now we always end with a challenge or a call to action, and this one is going to be age based. So it depends on what demographic you fall in, what your challenge is. So I'm going to start with our audience that's in their 30s to 50s. I want you to first think about this concept of social reserve and ask yourself, are you doing enough now to build up your social reserve for the future? Spend a few minutes thinking about that concept. Odds are you probably aren't and maybe could do better. And if so, prioritize relationships by scheduling them and making them intentionally. If you're in your 70s or 80s, I think the best thing for you to do, the first small step would be to focus on quality over quantity and think, what is one relationship, not a new relationship I can start, but a current relationship I have that I can improve or deepen, and then go do that. If you're somebody who's in the middle, so if you're, from age 50 to 70, you have to do both, since you're in between. And then anybody younger than that, if you're in your 20s, just avoid the big mistakes. That would be my call to the 20-year-olds.
It's a good one.
Try not to mess it up
If we all could
early
do
on.
that, if we all
All
could do
right.
that.
All right, perfect. Well, Melanie, thank you so much. The title of our session today was Aging Well Socially, How to Remain Connected to People and Purpose Throughout Your Life. Our guest expert today was Dr. Melanie Chandler. Melanie, thank you so much for joining us here on the Human Optimization Project.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
Great. It was a fantastic session. We really appreciate it. And to our audience, remember to live intentionally, consistently better. Keep striving to be the best human you can be so you can give your gifts back to the world, and never stop optimizing. Thanks for listening to the Mayo Clinic Human Optimization Project. If you like this episode, hit subscribe and leave a review. It helps others find us. Know someone who might benefit? Share the episode with them to join us in our mission to help as many people as possible become the best humans they can be. Have feedback or a topic idea? Email us at optimize@mayo.edu. And be sure to look for us on Instagram, X, and YouTube.
This podcast is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be relied upon for medical, professional, or legal advice. Always consult with a qualified professional for any questions. The appearance of any guest does not imply an endorsement of them, their employer, or any entity they represent. The views and opinions expressed by the guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of Mayo Clinic. Reference to any product, service, or entity is for informational purposes only and does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by Mayo Clinic.